Rhode Island. I'm the Reverend Dr. Don Anderson, Executive Minister of the Rhode Island State Council of Churches, and your host for this edition of Access Rhode Island. Today, we're going to talk about the issue of domestic violence in Rhode Island in general, and in particular, look at how men can be involved in helping to reduce this difficult problem in our society. I have two guests with me today, but before I introduce our guests, I'd like to read to you some information about domestic violence and its effect in our state. Across the United States, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been the victim of severe physical violence by an intimate partner. These alarming numbers should come as no surprise, as headline after headline we read that a mother, an ex-wife, a family member who has murdered someone they once loved. Rhode Island is no exception to these national problems. There are 6 member agencies of the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and they provide services to over 9,700 people every year related to domestic violence issues. Law enforcement officers responded to 7,930 domestic violence calls in 2013 alone. All of these statistics repeat themselves year after year right here in the Ocean State. From 2002 to 2012, at least 79 Rhode Islanders have died as a result of domestic violence. Over 88% of these perpetrators are responsible for the domestic violence. Those perpetrators have been men. In addition to the horrible loss of life, domestic violence also has a terrible impact on children. Children who are exposed to domestic violence are much more susceptible to increase their concern over issues like alcoholism, substance abuse, depression, and chronic health problems. This, in a snapshot, is domestic violence in Rhode Island. The question is, how can we be engaged in this, and how can men help in this particular issue? I have two guests with us today who are going to help us talk about this issue and maybe help us understand how we can do that. The first is Rafael Zapata, who is the Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Providence College. Welcome, Rafael.
Thank you, Reverend.
And Ben Ellcome, who describes himself as an artist at large. And we'll get at that in just a minute, but welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having us.
It's really good to have both of you here. Tell me a little bit about how you found out about domestic violence. And, well, before we do that, though, tell us a little bit about what you do in your work. Rafael, would you tell us a little bit about your work and what you do?
Right now, I am, since January of 2012, I've been the Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Providence College, and my job is essentially to help create a campus community in which all people can thrive, whether you're a staff member, a student, a faculty member, or even a member of the local community that comes onto our campus. We want to create an environment where all people can feel respected, have their human dignity affirmed, and as far as participating in the community, just feeling like they can engage fully in everything the college has to offer. So that's it in a nutshell.
Great. Where were you before you came to Providence College?
For 10 years, I was at Swarthmore College right outside of Pennsylvania, small liberal arts college, and prior to that, I was at New York University. And throughout this, I've always sought to enhance equity and justice in higher education, as well as in the communities in which these institutions were situated.
That's great.
Very lucky.
Ben, what is an artist at large?
Yeah, well, I sort of work in the Newport community in general, and I guess I wear many hats, but I was trained as a fine artist, and I found many ways to sort of look at community organizing and a way of bringing people together using the arts, as in public muraling or events where we get to bring different parts of our community or different diverse parts of our community together to have one conversation. And that conversation can be about domestic violence, or it could be about health inequities, anything where when we get different groups to talk, help to bring our community to a stronger place.
Right. Rafael, in your work on college campuses, do you see instances of domestic violence? We know Providence College is a great school, a lot of terrific students, but do you see instances of this in your work?
My colleagues in student affairs are charged with managing that, but college campuses, whether it be at Providence or at Swarthmore or at NYU or the schools I myself attended, those issues happen on college campuses. Relationship violence is what it's typically referred to, but it's the same as domestic violence, and it'll show up in terms of stalking, inappropriate communications via email or texting, as well as face-to-face communication, as well as physical. Holding someone back, not letting someone out of their room because they want to be heard, they want to finish a conversation. So the same, as well as the kind of physical altercations. And but that's a reality that is not unique to college campuses, but in many ways, college campuses have services, psychological counseling available. We also have a network of support that is available to our students that sometimes people may not have available or believe they have available outside the college campus. But throughout, the challenge is always helping people understand that this is wrong and that they can get help and where to find it.
Great. Ben, how do you see domestic violence in the work that you do in the community and so forth?
Sure. I mean, you can't go to any community or any town or any organization and not see some impact of domestic violence. It hurts our children, our neighborhoods. We look at community development being impacted by domestic violence. So doing community organizing work in Newport, it's impossible to do that work without having a conversation about domestic violence, interpersonal violence, we also call it, because we begin to talk about how same-sex couples begin to have these issues. And when we talk about it as domestic violence, sometimes we're only seeing it as a man and a woman having these disputes. But they fall in all different forms, all different genders, race, income levels. There's not a part of our society that isn't affected by it.
Well, we want to focus today on the specific ways in which men are engaged in domestic violence and what's happening in that way. So what do you think men can do in terms of helping this? Or how are men in general a hindrance, perhaps, to what goes on with domestic violence?
Well, we know from all the statistics and from working with young men in our communities that 90% of us are not or do not act in a violent form, and we do not interact with our intimate partners in a violent way. But a very small percentage of men sort of speak for us. So when you see everything that happens in the media and in the news, you think that men in general are perpetrators of domestic violence. But we know that's not true. But we know that our silence as men help the men that perpetrate domestic violence. We're sort of not part of the solution at that point. So as we look at our work with women's centers or with the women's movement, we try to see ourselves as allies to the women that are doing the work, and that we need to use our voice and we need to use our privileges that we carry as men to be part of a solution instead of just part of what's happening.
What do you see in terms of what men can do, Rafael, in assisting and helping to deal with this issue of domestic violence?
Well, I think we have to reflect on how we define being a man may play into this. I think we're as men, whatever your sexual orientation or whatever your gender identity, if you identify as a man, you're supposed to be a certain type of way. You're supposed to be strong. You're supposed to be invulnerable, stoic, tough, and there's some self-reliant, and there's some things that are positive about that, but there are also some things that may leave us prone. And I think we get these mixed messages, and part of those definitions of masculinity that are almost impossible to live up to is just to be invulnerable. And anyone who gets in your way, sometimes we're told that we need to step over them. And that may sound extreme, but I think it plays out in ways that, in terms of interpersonal violence, men against men, as well as men against women. And I think the last thing a man wants to be portrayed as is as a woman. And I think sometimes that plays a role. So as a man, we have to really reflect on how we define manhood and think of more what's called progressive masculinities, ones that aren't predicated on dominating other men or dominating women. And so I think having the conversation is an important start, being reflective about it, and living up to the best ideals of what what a person should be, a man should be.
Yeah, and I see that it's important many times when we have these conversations is that we need to interact with each other in a way that we support each other in making these better decisions about what masculinity could be, about what we see masculinity as. So it's important that we act as peer role models, or that we act in our community in a way that we like to see the young men around us or our peers also acting in that way. So being part of this ability to speak out as men on domestic violence is a fairly new thing.
And I think a lot of times we're performing for other men, and I'm thinking back as a teenager, as we're trying to learn what it means and perform or kind of live up to these goals to be men. There's also a lot of fear of not living up to it, because if you don't live up to these kind of impossible expectations of manhood, you yourself can become a victim of scorn or violence. So it can, again, these mixed messages are very real. And all of us are exposed to them, and oftentimes they're reinforced by women. Not exclusively, but you can hear our mothers tell us, be a man, don't cry.
Man up.
Right, man up, and so on and so forth. And so I think we take these for granted, and I think we can, if we pause and think about it and give men the space to acknowledge that it can be scary. What do I do in terms of solving interpersonal conflict? Does it always have to be about showing how strong I am? And again, I see that as very related to how domestic violence happens.
So one of the things I know in the subtleties of this, and one of the things that's difficult for men, whether it's in the locker room at the gym or at the golf course, or guys are out fishing or whatever, we all know the kind of humor that men use that often is at the expense of women. And can you talk a little bit about that, about how humor, defined in whatever way, fits into all this, and how men respond to that, or can respond to that?
Yeah. I can think of a personal instance where, I work with a group of men every day when I was a professional sailor, and those conversations and those topics and those jokes would come up all the time. And as I became more aware of myself and more aware of the impact that those stories and those jokes had, I began to sort of step back from those conversations. And with the men that were closest to me, I was willing to open up and begin to talk about the impact that those jokes have. And I had a friend, just a regular guy. He wasn't a bad guy. He didn't commit violent acts of crimes or anything. He was just a man that worked every day. And I remember for a long time, our interactions got really rough because I was holding back, and I didn't want to, associate with men in that way. And it put me outside of this box that we're all caught up in as men. And he had a young daughter. Soon after that, and his perspective all of a sudden changed on the world, where he went from just sort of being a single man to a married man to a man that was then raising a young girl, and hearing those jokes then impacted him, and he apologized one day after him telling one of those jokes that he slipped up into, as sometimes we often do when we're hanging out with our friends. And I remember him really all of a sudden at that point realizing that those things I would just slowly bring up every now and then and talk about really begin to have an impact when he saw it affect his family, which is something before then he didn't have. So the three of us have been involved in a program that was sponsored by the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence called 10 Men. Rafael, you want to talk a little bit about the program?
Sure. 10 Men is a program that is pretty self-explanatory in terms. The coalition identified 10 men in the state of Rhode Island, of which Ben and I are part, and you yourself, who would agree to serve as advocates against domestic violence, to educate others. And the way I found out about it, I'm also a member of the Rhode Island. Help me out here. The Rhode Island
Commission on Prejudice
and Bias. I apologize.
That's okay. That's all right.
We were having conversations about how, sexual assault and these issues, how they may be related to bias. And one of the other members, Beatriz Perez, who works for the health department, saw how I was engaged in the conversation and suggested I be in touch with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence and be part of 10 Men. And I'd always appreciated that I've been raised by strong women, my mother, my sister, my sisters, and my aunts, and I learned early on to kind of the contradictions in my own attitudes and the things I learned about. And I considered myself an ally, and this was a perfect opportunity to channel that in community with other men. And so that's how I got involved, and we began meeting monthly and thinking about ways in which we can serve as allies and advocates around this issue, especially targeting other men.
I know one of the things that really spoke to me some years ago, and I was doing camping work, and we had a retreat with some young people. These were older elementary school, middle school young people, and this girl and boy got in a squabble over something, I don't know, pizza or whatever it was.
Sure.
And he was probably about 10 years old. And I'd never seen someone this age, but he hauled off like this and whacked this girl right across the face. I mean, pretty intentionally. And she went flying back, you know, and I immediately stepped in and grabbed that young man and brought him outside and said, we need to have a talk here. And I asked him, you know, why he did this and what was, you know, what the purpose, what was going on here. And he looked at me and said, well, you know, sometimes you've just got to put women in their place. And I think a 10-year-old kid didn't come up with this on his own, right?
No.
And so I spoke to him a little bit about that. I said, well, you know, here we don't do that kind of thing, and explained it to him. And he listened dutifully for about 7 or 8 minutes, and then he looked at me and said, come on now. We men know how we have to treat these women. And I thought to myself, you know, that boy left there without me having reached him, you know, with any significant thing. And it really scared me, and it impressed upon me how our behaviors really affect those around us. And it had just been driven into that boy that this was normal behavior for men. Ben, why did you get involved in this kind of work?
Sure. I left the sailing industry when I was living in Newport, and I started working in youth development for different organizations between schools and after-school programs. And the more and more young men that I began to be involved with as a mentor or as a coach in the different roles that we played, you realized that violence was sort of part of an answer or part of a way that they made through the day. And it was harder and harder to come up with ways to have these conversations. At the time, one of the organizations I worked with got involved with the Women's Resource Center in Newport. And through different advocates and different people there, I began to get a lot of training. And that training really began to sort of demystify a lot of the things that I took for granted about masculinity and about our society. We talked about racism, and we talked about institutionalized ideas that are part of what we do. And that brought me to sort of finding ways to work with young men that are sort of outside our typical mold. So working on programming that really focuses on violence and nonviolence. And I can say that I've been really well trained by a bunch of community organizations that allowed me the space to make my own mistakes and part of my own personal journey in this. And that's a lot of what 10 Men has been too. It's allowed a group of men that either were already part of the work or were new to the work being sort of domestic violence and advocating. And it gave us a chance to really have a conversation that often with our peers we're not allowed to have because people don't want to go there, or it's a bummer and why would we want to have that conversation. But it's really helpful as a group of men to be able to talk a lot of this out. And we have great guidance from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
So,
And for many years, I'll add that during my time as an educator, in my over 15 years, I've been lucky to work with young men, just to expose them on ways that we're taught to be men, through the media, through our relationships with our families. So, and even in working in local communities, like I learned from other amazing men during my time in New York. Just been able to do that and raise that awareness and do so with compassion, because this is something that somebody gave me when I used inappropriate language. And sometimes it was a woman, it was a friend, it was someone in my life, or it was even a stranger, and helped me understand that my words carried meaning. So using inappropriate language. And that's really the point, not to demonize others, but to help them understand that words, attitudes can become actions. And you may not beat someone, but there's a whole spectrum in which that can reflect that we can devalue other people, in this case women, and I want to be part of moving that in other directions.
Well, we've still got a little more time, but before time runs out, I want to make sure we have a phone number here on the table, and I'll give that phone number. It's 800-494-8100. 800-494-8100. And if someone was interested in finding out about how to be more engaged in this work or wanted to talk about domestic violence for any reason, but especially if there are men who are interested in being engaged with this work, they can call this number, get in touch with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and find out how they can become engaged in this work. And we certainly would encourage men to do that. One of the things that you said, Rafael, I think is really, really important. No one's trying to demonize anyone. No one's trying to say, we're good guys, you're bad guys, we're holier than you, any of that. It's just that in our society, the issues that foster domestic violence are so part of who and what we do. And as young men, the way we're raised, the things we already talked about, even just the slogans and the things the parents tell us growing up, how that really puts into us something that suggests that we really need to be intentional about changing our ways, and that we can help one another. It's not a matter of preaching at someone, but a matter of just getting to know each other and working together to be able to do this. In the last minute or so, I'm just wondering, could one of you talk a little bit about the summit that was held this year as part of the 10 Men Project, and what happened at that summit?
It was held at Rhode Island College in late September. And it brought together members of the community. We try to invite as many men as possible, young men, and it was intergenerational, and we shared statistics, we showed some video clips, and just had a conversation, just what we talked about. And the goal was to bring more people in, to learn about it, and maybe even recruit members for the next 10 Men session. I'll also add that the group of 10 men that Ben and I are part of, we're not going to stop doing the work. So next year's summit, and I'll say this on TV, is going to happen at
Rafael's
Providence
making a
College.
commitment.
We're going to make it happen. And we've been able to support one another, and this critical mass of men has made a big difference. And I think we'll be able to sustain it. So.
And as 10 Men, we've been able to bring people in that have been part of the work and haven't been part of the work. So part of the process is that you don't have to be sort of a social worker, or you don't have to be a man that's engaged in the community already, but if you have that willingness to try and make change, that willingness to say that the things that are happening around you with your peers in your community that you would like to see change, we're there to help you. So as the group of 10 men, you're brought into that fold, and you're given language, and you're given understanding and tools, and you're also given the space to make mistakes, because we all say the wrong thing, or we make a wrong judgment every now and then, and this is a safe space for men to figure out how to change their path, how to go on a different journey and talk about masculinity, and it takes time, and that's why we're here.
And how to be an advocate in a supportive space, and yeah.
So as we start to really focus in here, let me just ask you each quickly, what would be the one most important message you'd like to share with other men as they are just maybe encountering this for the first time, or coming aware of this at a newer level?
Sure. I think when I first start working with young men, the conversation is always around the fact that our privileges that we grow up with, the things that we've been given as men, often blind us to a lot of the problems in our communities. And as we begin to understand our privilege, we begin to understand that our voice is some of our strongest tools that we can use, that when we advocate for people around us and for the people that we care about, there's real strength. And that adds to our community, and that adds to our community health. And that's really the strength that I would like to see men be able to take on, and that strength. Nothing more than the voice that you already have being used in a way to support people instead of take people down.
Rafael?
Again, this is not about judgment, it's about learning. It's about engaging, it's about having a conversation and trying to be our better selves. If you see yourself as a good person, let's live that out, right? Let's be our better selves, and let's reflect on maybe those times we're not, and where does that come from, and just kind of, this is a space where that can be done. And again, you don't have to be an expert of any kind. You don't have to have a particular degree, but you just have to want to know more and want to be engaged.
Great. Well, guys, it's really been good to have you with us for this program. Time has really flown, and I know we could have told a lot more stories. I think the important message we want to get to everyone is that every man can have a part to understanding better about ourselves, what it really means to be a man, and how we can live in a society that works for the betterment of all. Thank you for joining us for this edition.
Another 5 minutes.
Oh, we do?
Oh, he gave me the 5-minute thing about 5 minutes ago.
We'll tell you when there's 1 minute left. You gotta keep going.
Oh, okay. Well, okay.
We'll fix it.
We still have some more time
All right,
here.
what do you want to talk about?
So we've got
How about
plenty
that
of
game?
stories, and we
Talk
can
about the game?
we can get going. I've got a question, but if you want to say something.
Start with the question. That might be a good start.
So earlier, before we started coming in here and talking before we started to tape the program, the reality is that sports plays an inordinate amount of place in the lives of men, especially young men, but even men as they age. And we spoke about a football player who was involved in a very, very well-known case where he beat up his then fiancée, now wife, in an elevator that was on the tape, and so people have had a chance to see that. What do you find and think about the place of sports and violence and this whole place of domestic violence? And yet, this is coming from a guy who loves sports, but a big Patriots fan. But I think we do have to ask ourselves these questions about what place does this play in our lives.
As we're being raised as young men, we're always looking for role models and models of leadership. Many of our young men are being raised without fathers, so they're looking even for more leadership from outside of their family structure. So often that falls to sports, and that falls to coaches, and that falls to those people and those heroes that we have that we get to watch every day, either play basketball or play football, or for me it was sailing. And it is important that we embrace that structure not as an evil or not as a end out of things that are going wrong, but look at all those great players that are out there and making good work and making good challenges. And I think that in a time when we're being challenged by a player making a bad decision, look at all the good players that have come around to make the right decision, to really support the work and support the conversation. And that's been really important too. It's also opened a door for us to have a greater conversation with our peers and with our friends about what domestic violence and issues of violence are. But, as young men, we're looking for support. We're looking for that idea of leadership, and that comes from sports often.
And Rafael, what are you seeing with college students?
Well, I would say I want to get back at this question because I think sports is so much a part of our culture, and for me, sports was helpful because I could let out my aggression in ways that were not hurtful. So I don't think domestic violence is unique to people who play sports or aggressive sports. I think it's something that that happens across different occupations and different class levels. So
I've got to bring us to a close. This time we really do have to stop. And I apologize for the staff who earlier. Thank you so much for hanging in with us, folks. We're glad to be together. And let us just say this. Thanks, gentlemen, for being with us. Let's all work together to make Rhode Island the very best possible place can be for all of us, both men and women. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.